to understand more about these issues, Amelia Parnell, Vice President for Research and Policy from NASPA, the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators. Take it from here for your panel on credentials and pathways.
Thank you, Holly. And I know I put in the chat at the start that we have so much to cover in so little time, but I think we can squeeze quite a few questions into this kind of laying the foundation portion of the agenda, which is going to focus on credentials and pathways with a focus on definitions. And so we have 4 people joining me. I'm not sure if they'll get pinned so you can see them, but we have Paul, Cynthia, Karen, and Deb. And so I prepared some questions that I hope to take us through micro, no pun intended with the micro credentials theme, but a micro level discussion where it starts with students to then talk about the impact of this discussion on campuses. And then from there, looking at employers, and then from there, the full community. So if we do this well, I think we can cover about 20 minutes. And I just want to dive, honestly, right in so we don't waste any time. So Paul, you have a new book with Michelle Van Noy, and the title is Credentials: Understand the Problems, Identify the Opportunities, Create the Solutions. In part 1, you mentioned that your book was prompted by a bit of a paradox, which is the proliferation of credentials has created too much choice, a situation in which misjudgments can become more likely and risk can outpace benefits. So if we're thinking about this in the context of students, starting there, how can definitions actually help students navigate the many credential choices that they have?
It's a great question to begin with, because the fact is that the current welter of definitions for programs and for credentials and even for disciplines and certainly for terms is really an obstacle to their navigation at present. And I think it's a particular concern because the obstacle tends to be the greatest for students who lack the kind of savvy that a privileged upbringing can provide, or that a very well-heeled high school counseling program can provide. There are more than 300 varieties of MBA.
Lawyer, and then our attorney.
Hello? Somebody was commenting. At any rate, more than 300 varieties of the MBA. Think of the different ways the term applied is used these days, depending on the degree, but depending on the kind of degree. Even applied doctorates these days. The doctorate degree is something that most people used to believe they understood, and now there are many different varieties, including something called an applied PhD, which would appear to be a contradiction in terms. Programs that may appear familiar, but in fact can be deceptive. There's a new program that enables one to become a health coach. You would think that might have something to do with medicine. It really doesn't. And it has very little relation to that. And so figuring out what programs actually are about. So I suggest 3 quick steps in terms of addressing the problem. First, I think we need to appeal to the disciplines to achieve greater order and clarity within themselves. And the MBA is a great example of that. Some degree of standardization would not limit the ability of schools to respond to emerging needs or to compete effectively with one another. Second, I think the initiatives we are concerned with, Credential Engine, Credentials as you go, and through, frankly, through a book like ours, we need to move towards consensus. We need to identify the most problematical areas of misunderstanding and work together towards resolving them. And finally, I think we do need to give particular attention to the students that I mentioned a little while ago, those that don't have the benefit of well-qualified high school counseling or of informed scuttlebutt from their peers. Every high school curriculum should be responsible for preparing students, to use your words, to navigate the many credential choices they have. And every college and post-secondary education provider should make it its business to be explicit about its terms, what they mean, and how students can navigate the opportunities that they make available. I think that's 3 minutes.
Paul, I think you really have summed it all up. I think if there was an analogy here for a mic drop, I think it just happened. I don't want to yield the rest of the time, but I could say I think you've set the stage really well for a nice follow-up from Cynthia. Yeah, boom, I saw it in there. So Paul, I think you've made it clear. You clearly answered the question about how the definitions need to help students, but putting this into practice, let's go one level up and look at this impact from a campus perspective. So the second thing that you mentioned was consensus. And before that, you mentioned disciplines. And I can imagine that connects really well to campuses. And imagine if all those campuses were connected to a system, perhaps the SUNY system. So Cynthia, I want to come to you next. The SUNY system currently offers more than 400 micro-credentials in more than 60 discipline areas. So students can choose by going online to the dedicated system website that has an offer for filters by topic or institution. And I imagine it takes a lot of effort to ensure that each campus within the system is approaching the definitions in a consistent way so that it becomes clear for students. How do you work with campuses to provide the type of reliable definitions that Paul has so eloquently described that they deserve?
Thank you very much for appropriately setting the stage, Amelia, because it is work. SUNY has 64 campuses. Right now, 31, about half, are offering micro-credentials. That is still an awful lot of people when you're talking about consistent messaging and language. I think we're fortunate in that we do have a system-wide micro-credential policy, which was adopted by a system-level board of trustees that has authority over the academic programs at all of our campuses. And the policy adopted in 2018 includes a glossary of terms, and what we really focus on is sort of a SUNY specific definition of high quality micro-credentials. And I'm happy to talk more about what that is if anyone wants to connect. But I thought that having a policy and a consistent micro-credential definition that applied to all campuses would really save us from nomenclature madness. It did not save us, but it did help, right? It did help. And I'll tell you that for SUNY, our biggest challenge initially was use of the terms micro-credential and digital badge interchangeably. And, you know, we were really pushing for sort of our micro-credential definition. And so we worked together to reframe the thinking there a little bit, to talk about digital badges as the technology that represented completion of the micro-credential. Ann Reed from SUNY's University of Buffalo, who's also a member of the CAG board, introduced me to this phrase: diploma is to degree as badge is to micro-credential. So we made great progress. I carried that message in presentations to all campuses, to all external partners. I had these large posters that I would walk around with, be swept up in the wind. And it was picked up pretty readily in media coverage of our program by other higher ed institutions in the state. We saw good recognition across New York State business and industry. But that's in our bubble, right? I know that nationally, badge is still used for everything from participation, community building, corporate training by very big companies. So it's still out there, right? There were also questions about the distinction between a certificate and a micro-credential. Now, in New York State, certificate is defined under education law. And so we had to be very clear that a micro-credential would be distinct from a certificate. And I know in other states, many folks consider certificates micro-credentials. So something else for this board to consider is, you know, state regulation, state ed law, and, you know, regulatory bodies. And I will say too, I worry a little bit about the term non-degree credential. 67% of SUNY's micro-credentials stack to a certificate or a degree. And I worry a little bit about referring to them as sort of non-degree credentials as distancing them from the degree, when we really talk about them pretty consistently as, you know, these pathways to degrees. So it's just something that I've been wrestling with in my mind. So that I'm sure that's more than my 3 minutes, but.
we're getting close, but I think that does make a nice transition. If you think about building blocks here, we've talked about the impact for the students. Cynthia, you really have described it. I mean, with 60 plus campuses, there's a lot to discuss. So I think we can still keep us moving in a good direction. So I want to go to Karen next. So building off of something that Cynthia described as the nomenclature madness and how a really great campaign for communication works well internally for a campus setting, but there's still going to be other players, one of which is employers. And so Karen, your organization, Workcred, engages in consulting and research and education and training and other activities to help various stakeholders understand the value and quality of credentials. And just as students need clear definitions, it's also critical for employers to understand and define their competency needs. So we talked about challenges for campuses, but could you maybe build on that and talk about a common challenge that's related to definitions that you often help employers address?
Yes, thank you, Amelia. And Cynthia stated it perfectly with nomenclature chaos. And that's certainly experienced by the employers as well, because when you think about all the campuses having to make decisions, it's really, I think, exponentially increased problem with the number of employers who have to think about how they consume all these different types of credentials with different names issued by different institutions. And what we've seen with employers is they struggle on their own to differentiate what's behind a credential. So what does a certificate mean? What does it stand for? What is a certification? And those challenges continue. So I think one of the biggest issues is how do we work with employers to help them better understand what's behind that credential? In essence, what can the individual know and is the individual able to do? And how does that match with the jobs that they have available in their own firms? And so that challenge, we see employers when we've talked to them who can't even identify that their employees have credentials. When we ask them, do your employees have credentials? What type of credentials do they have? Frequently, the employer is unsure. The hiring manager may have more information, but the average person within the organization is unsure about what those credentials are. And part of that is then, if they're unsure what they are, they're unsure how they relate to the job they have available. So does that job, is that credential based on some type of competency? If so, how is that easily articulated versus is that based on a learning outcome? And how can those be matched to the job or the role? And so that challenge, I think, is compounded by the fact that we know many employers offer training themselves. And in some cases, that training is offered from vendors. And that type of learning isn't really captured by the employer. And so that challenge as well for individuals as they're working within a firm to move either within that firm or to another firm is potentially hindered because employers are not, they don't want to be education and training providers. So they're not going to give a certificate for completion, and neither is the vendor going to give a certification because that's not their job. It's part of teaching someone how to use a particular tool. But yet there's all this information that happens in employers that's not gathered. And so how do we think about that as well? So I think, definitions are important because they do provide clarity. But how is that going to kind of sort itself out? Is that going to be through technologies like blockchain or learning and employment records that really allows people to consume a myriad of information from different sources? And that would help employers tremendously as they're trying to find the right person to fill the right role or job in their firm.
Absolutely, Karen. Deb, I guess you figured out we're going to come to you next. If I had to picture it as a relay, you got the anchor leg. So we've now built the blocks up from the student to the campus to the employer community to everyone else that's involved in this huge ecosystem. So I had a final question prepared for all of you. And if we have time, that's okay. But Deb, I don't want to rush you. You got a couple. Yes, Deb is a great anchor. I'll give the closing remarks to tie all this together. So I want to make maybe what might be the final question come to you. So thinking about this from a technology standpoint. So Cynthia talked a little bit about that. Credential Engine, which is where you work, is focused on bringing credential transparency through technology. So for example, Credential Engine has an online registry that has access to credential and skills data in a common language of the credential transparency description language. So speaking of definitions and language, what does credential transparency mean and how is it useful for shared definitions for incremental credentialing?
So let me give a couple of nods to things that have already been said. To Paul's point about the cacophony, our research shows that there are over 1 million credentials offered just in the US, right? Now that's a pretty big number. How does anyone make sense of all of that and navigate, right? And yet, to Julie's point, we have to roll up our sleeves and get work done. So when I think about definitions, I think about different types of definitions that are useful for different audiences and purposes, right? There are going to be take marketing, for example. There's going to be all kinds of like crazy synonyms and other things that get made up for marketing pizzazz. And, you know, there's a purpose for that. And then there's definitions that are needed by various types of experts. So if you're someone who's developing a credential, or if you're an employer who's trying to make use of that credential, or maybe you're an accreditor evaluating, or other quality assurance provider, you know, those are going to be much more explicit definitions, right? And if you're a policymaker, whether that's at the institution or like the SUNY system level, or state and federal or national governments, policymakers need a particular type of language also. And then I like to call out how credential engines work with the Credential Transparency Description Language, or CTDL, gives us machine readable definitions. And let me talk through that a little bit with a specific example, because I think it helps make it clear. So if you think of a certification, a lot of people use the word certificate and certification interchangeably, and that's just a mistake because they are very different. And one of the key differences is that certifications have to be renewed. That's a critically important thing for everyone to know, right? So if you're looking at that from a marketing perspective, well, even if you have a common parlance, jazzy marketing description of a credential that's a certification, you should at least let the consumer know that it's something that needs to be renewed. It's not a lifetime one and done credential, right? And if you're an employer, then you need to know that certification, they're often issued by industry bodies. And so you need to know, is that relevant for your industry? Maybe this is even a required certification for legal compliance, for example, right? So then you need to know specifics about that certification. If you're developing it, it's like, what are the renewal processes? What's the assessment process? Policymakers need to decide, are we giving public money for obtaining that certification, or for renewing it, or both? And this, the machine readable CTDL can serve all of those purposes, because what it does is that the definition is not just a couple of sentences or however long it takes to describe that credential, but it's linked open data that connects many different data points, where the definition is actually a graph of information. So when you're looking at that certification, you can see, what are the competencies it includes? Is it renewable? What's its occupational alignment? What's the time to complete? And those are humanly readable links that you can follow, and the individual person can follow, but it's also machine readable for systems to be able to help all of us make sense.
All right. Well, we are right close to time. I think we got 1 minute left. And I would say, if you have seen these pieces fitting together in a way that's interesting, the next piece of the puzzle is the next part of the discussion about how this whole thing connects to equity, inclusion, and fairness. And so my idea at first was to ask one final question, but I think I see the connection pretty obviously, that if we have the definitions in place, the technology is enabled the right way, the mission for the students is clear. I think that Paul and Deb and Karen and Cynthia have laid the foundation for the next conversation. So if this wasn't enough for you all to grasp and you want more, please check out Paul's book, check out the work of the SUNY system, Workcred, and Credential Engine. And I think we can keep the conversation going from here. So I want to pass it back, if it's a talk show in jeopardy, back to you, Holly.